Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning to the channel, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. This time I'll be making something a bit different. I decided to have a go at a storage or cookie jar. I used some new techniques and some I've learned on previous projects. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first job was to get the Sapele to dimension. I was aiming for a finished thickness of 25mm. Using the jointer, I squared up 2 sides on 5 lengths of timber before moving on to the Metabo thicknesser to finish getting it to size. I used to work with timber that was left rough sawn, figuring the process of making the segmented rings got rid of any irregularities. But since I've been milling to dimension, the quality of the finished projects has significantly improved, so much so that now I wouldn't consider doing it any other way. After milling the timber, I then had to cut the segments, 108 in total, for 6 rings. For this I used a table saw and a miter sled set to 10 degrees. Each segment is cut to 29mm, and with a 2mm resin joint, this will give me a finished diameter of around 185mm, a perfect fit for the casting bucket. And each segment has to be hand sanded to remove the raggy bits. They need to be cleaned up so I don't get any floaters in the resin joints. Then it's on to assembling the segmented rings. Using a 3D printed template, I loosely arranged the segments, then I used an elastic band to hold them in place. When that's done, I used another 3D printed spacer with 18 locating pins on either side. This is pressed into the joints, then superglued in place. It's a new idea I came up with, and I have to say, it's worked very well. To assemble the next ring, I came up with some more 3D printed spacers. This one is split so I can remove it after the next ring is glued in place. The plan was to put a few segments in position, then position the grey joint template, and then completely fill the ring. It sort of worked, allowing me to glue another white spacer on top, but I still had to pull the 2 rings apart to remove the grey template. With the grey template removed, I put the 2 segmented rings back together and glued another white joint spacer in place to keep the joints consistent. Then I dripped superglue on the dry inner joint, which tied it all together. This gave me a solid base to work from as I built up the rest of the rings. The bigger solid white spacer is placed under the lower ring to stop the segments sagging. For the rest of the rings, I decided to build them up on the template, glue a joint spacer in position, then put that on top of the main blank, using the split spacers to maintain a consistent joint thickness between the rings, whilst I superglued them together. As you can see, the blank is coming together nicely, so I'll skip ahead to the assembled blank. With the last ring glued in place, the main blank was finished, and whilst the segments were a little bit irregular, I was happy with the end result. So on with the next stage. I wanted to try something new for the resin casting. I've had some plastic sheet kicking around for a while, so I used it to form a mould around the segmented blank. I figured this would cut down on the amount of resin I would need to use. Once the sheets were securely stuck together, I wrapped it around the segmented blank using an elastic band to loosely hold it in place, whilst I added more strips of tape to fix it tightly against the segments. This was followed by more tape, continuously wrapped around the outside, and more tape across the base to completely seal the mould. It might seem a bit of overkill, but if I left one tiny hole, the resin would find it, and it would have been a pointless exercise. Anyway, with the mould completed, I put the whole thing in a pre-waxed bucket, just in case it did leak. Off camera, I'd made a waste block to fill the centre void, and after checking to make sure it would fit, I mixed a small amount of resin and primed the softwood. This would also cut down on the amount of epoxy resin I would need to mix for the main casting. The main casting I mixed 2 batches, figuring I could quickly mix another if needed. I used my usual brand, mixed at a 2:1 ratio. The chosen colour for this project was sapphire blue alcohol dye. I was going for the translucent effect, something I haven't done before. But whilst mixing, I had second thoughts, and I decided to add a small amount of blue mica powder to make it more opaque. Pouring the resin was straightforward enough, though I did pour it slowly to hopefully cut down on any trapped air bubbles. And as it turned out, there wasn't enough, so I mixed another batch, coloured the same, and poured it in the casting. I placed some weight on top and put the whole thing in the pressure pot, added 50 psi and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day, and with the blank removed from the bucket, I could see that there hadn't been any leaks, and after removing the plastic sheet, the casting looked good, with no voids or cracks, though I'd made one mistake, but more of that later. And with the waste blocks chiseled flush with the top, I drilled a hole dead centre in the top and bottom and fixed the blank to the lathe. With the lathe turned up to around 800 RPM, I set about removing the thin layer of resin covering the segmented rings. The Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher made quick work of exposing the segments, and whilst there were a few voids, I was pretty sure these would disappear as I got closer to the finished surface. When most of the waste resin was removed, I switched to the skew chisel hoping this would take care of what was left, but I had to go down a bit further, so I switched to the bowl gouge to cut thin layers off the segments until I was down to a clean surface. To level the surface, I used the gouge to shear scrape and the skew to remove the tool marks. It still needed some work, but it was close enough to where I needed it to be, so I moved on to cutting a mortise in either end of the blank. Before cutting the mortise, first I needed to level the base. I wanted to leave a layer of resin over the segments to act as a joint when I glued the end piece on, so I only removed just enough to get down to a level surface. Then I had to remove any trace of the white joint spacer. I could have left it, but it was easier to do it now. To cut the mortise recess, I used a 1/4 inch parting tool to define the outer edge and the gouge to remove the inner material. Then I used a dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail, and after a bit of tidying up, it was done. I turned the blank around and set to cutting another mortise. This is the base, and to be honest, I didn't need to do this. I could have just levelled the base and cut away some of the inner material and then glued on the sapele, but I wasn't thinking. Anyway, you live and you learn. So moving on, I've skipped ahead and I've turned the blank around once more. So now I'm working on the top, and this is where the mistake I mentioned earlier has to be addressed. The scrap pieces of wood I placed on top when I cast the blank are showing through the edge of the resin joint, so I used a chisel to cut them out. The void would be filled later when I glued the top on, which is the next thing I did. I mixed some rapid setting epoxy with mica powder and alcohol dye to match the main blank joint colour and applied a liberal amount to the top surface. Then I placed the top sapele blank in place and used a tailstock to apply pressure and squeeze the joint nice and tight. I filled the chiselled out voids and left it for 30 minutes for the epoxy to fully cure. Then I set to getting the top balanced and to round. And whilst I was at it, I tidied up some minor repairs I'd done on the main blank. Now as you can see, the top is too thick, but there is a reason I left it this size. Firstly, I forgot to cut it down on the bandsaw before I glued it on, but that aside, with the top cut off, I can use the leftover piece to make the lid. After removing the top section, I then had to cut another mortise. The reason for doing so many is so that I can keep the main blanks centred on the lathe whilst I'm gluing the top and bottom sapele blanks in place. There might have been another way to do it, but this is what worked for me. and you've seen me do this enough times already. So skipping ahead, with this mortise cut, I turned the blank around and glued on the base. And with the base in place and the grain aligned with the top, this was also left for 30 minutes. Then I got the base to round and balanced, and I also cut another section off the blank to thin it down to match the upper blank. Then, you guessed it, I cut another mortise, and this time I added a finish, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. Now I can get on with the final shaping of the outside. The blank has been turned around, hopefully for the last time. The base is now being held by the chuck, and the tailstock is providing additional support. Using the 3/8 bowl gouge, I began shaping the base, forming a curved transition into the side, switching to the carbide cutter to refine the profile, and to keep the design in balance, I did the same to the top. Then it was on to the midsection. For this I used a skew, working across the full height of the blank, refining the surface, and when I was happy it was done, I sanded with 80 grit to check for any ridges or low spots. With the outside more or less done, it was time for hollowing out. I began with a bowl gouge to cut through the top Sapele blank into the segmented midsection below. I wasn't too worried about shaping the top, I would deal with that later, but it was only now that I fully appreciated how much work it was going to take to remove all the waste material. A bit of a head start, I used a 40mm Forstner bit to cut away the central core. This had a short shank, so it only went down about halfway, but it was good enough for now. That done, I used a side cutting scraper to cut away the softwood waste block, trying to take light cuts so I didn't get a catch. As I exposed more of the epoxy resin, I switched to the full-size carbide with a negative rate cutter, then went back to the side cutting scraper to remove the softwood. I continued like that for a while, but I couldn't see what I was doing, so I rotated the headstock, which gave me much better access. With the access problem solved, I went at the hollowing out, switching between different tools, trying to find the most efficient at removing the waste. This went on for what seemed like hours, with the ever-present threat of a big catch that would rip the workpiece off the lathe. I've speeded the next bit of footage up to around 10 times normal speed. Eventually I got down to the halfway point, so I repositioned the headstock and drilled down to the Sapele base. That done, I turned the headstock 45 degrees and went back to hollowing out. It's pretty much more of the same. The only difference was I changed the cutter in my mid-sized carbide to a normal flat profile, and this ripped through the waste, so much so the tool got too hot to hold, so I had to stop and let it cool down. As I said, what follows is just more of what you've already seen, and for the most part, you can't see what's happening because my hand is in the way. So moving on, when the inside was hollowed out, I reset the headstock and cut the lid recess, and refined the curved upper surface. It took around 3 hours to hollow it out, but after a final bit of sanding, apart from the finishing, it was done. The next thing to do was the lid. I fixed the offcut on the lathe and began shaping the underside. First I faced it off, then I reduced the diameter to fit the recess in the rim. To get rid of the excess, I used the bowl gouge to thin it down. Then I shear scraped the edge, cutting away the waste until it was close to the pencil line. After a quick check to make sure it would fit, I refixed it to the lathe so I could cut a shallow mortise, but it was slipping, so I used the coal jaws to hold it. Then I finished cutting the mortise and I cut a rebate around the edge. Underside done, I sanded to 600 grit and applied a finish. Then I turned it around so I could shape the top. To shape the top, I shear scraped a slight curve from the centre down towards the edge, leaving a small flat spot in the centre. I used a large negative rate scraper to blend the surface, and then I sanded and applied a finish, topped off with gloss finishing wax. The last piece was the knob for the lid. I made this from African blackwood. I used the bowl gouge to get it to round, then a combination of the detail spindle gouge and the skew to form the shape. The 1/4 inch parting tool was used to cut the locating pin. It was then sanded to 400 grit and a finish applied. I cut it free with a small pull saw and it was done. Now on to applying the finish to the main bit. After sanding from 80 to 3000 grit, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit. Just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away till no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, beginning with Mirka Polarshine 10, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polarshine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave the joints with a deep shine. To finish, Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished. I've been looking forward to doing this for a long time, and it didn't disappoint. I really enjoyed doing it, and I hope you like it too. It's a bit different to my usual style of pedestal bowl, but the end result looks great. The darker blue joints really make the Sapele segments pop, and the new techniques I used will be good for some of my upcoming projects. Anyway, with all that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.